The next speaker is Mr. Gilad Erdan, member of Knesset on behalf of the Likud, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Minister of Strategic Affairs, and Minister of Information. He was in his past Minister of Environmental Protection, Minister of Communication, Home Front Defense Minister. And many people don't know that while he was member of Knesset, he pursued legislation for the prevention of vehicle accidents. He was elected as Man of the Decade for fighting transportation accidents. On behalf of the Herzliya conference, I would like to invite Minister Erdan to the stage. Good morning. I am very happy to be here this year as well in this distinguished forum. Thank you very much to Professor Reichman, to General Amos Gilad, to my friend Amos Hoffman, heading this interesting conference, and thank you to all the guests who have come here from Israel and from overseas. Dear friends, look, in recent times, all countries in the world, but mostly the countries in the West, are realigning themselves to deal with modern terrorism, with the threats of modern terrorism, the terrorism that we call the lone wolf terrorism. The concern of the Islamic terrorism, it leads in fact to global processes that in the past used to be completely unacceptable. The Sunni countries stopping their connections, cutting off their connections with Qatar, countries in Europe changing their security perceptions, talking about changes in legislation, in revoking nationalities and citizenships, talking about the things that used to go against the DNA, the very DNA of those European countries. And why? I think you understand, because it is because the terrorist attacks that used to happen in the past in Israel or in the Middle East, and occasionally, to our dismay, would happen in other countries in the world, are now becoming everyday events in London, Brussels, Paris, Istanbul, San Bernardino, Manchester, and other places in the world. And this changes the perception of Western governments. But we're not talking just about governments. Internet companies as well are starting to understand, finally starting to understand, that they too must fight the incitement to violence and to hatred which is distributed on their very platforms. If you've noticed, just in recent years, Google has published this blog where it repents and admits, in fact, admits that it has not done enough in fighting incitement for terrorism, which is taking place on its platform. It owns, of course, YouTube, and it published this four-point program for fighting terrorism and incitement. I have to tell you that about a year ago, when I met the representatives of Google, we demanded those exactly the same 4 steps, and then they told us that it's impossible and it's technically not feasible. And you see, unfortunately, when terrorist attacks do take place, and when Western countries, Western governments join in this demand, then technical capabilities suddenly become accessible as well. And sadly, here we also have very painful reminders here and now about the change in the terrorist threats that we're dealing with. And this is exactly what happened here 6 days ago in the Nablus Gate, where Hadass Malka was killed. And when I eulogized her in on her funeral, and then I came to console her family and met her parents, David and Geula, an amazing family. I looked through her photos. I'm sure that I've done so with all the people in Israel, and I saw that young woman smiling, full of joy and joie de vivre, and all her future was ahead of her. And I spoke to her parents. I heard about how proud she was to serve in the border control, border police. There is one thing that remained etched on my heart when I left this meeting. Her parents said she, like many of her friends, didn't tell us what she was doing, didn't tell us much about the danger, but one weekend she told us, Mom, Dad, you don't even know what I'm doing. You don't know that without the border patrol, without the border police, there is no Jerusalem. Without our sovereignty in Jerusalem, the security that we provide in Jerusalem, there is no state of Israel. And when I heard this moving statement, this moving quote, I understood, and again, this has to do with the changes in the strategic threats on the state of Israel and its defense. I again understood that alongside the traditional heroes that we have, which are IDF soldiers, our pilots, our people in the armed brigades, and so on, but now when the home front, the civilians are at the front of terrorism, we have new heroes, and those are the police officers, and policemen and policewomen of the Israeli police, who are at the sensitive places in the city centers. It happens in Israel and abroad, and these heroes like Hadass Malka or the late Hadar Cohen and their friends are our true heroes of this new time, because now there is no longer a distinction between home front and the real front. There is no distinction between soldiers posted at the borders and police officers. Both have to make significant decisions with a split-second notice and stop with their very bodies the terrorists. In recent years, we've been facing a wave of terrorism which is unlike what we've seen in the past. 2 years ago, when I was appointed as Minister of Home Front Command, Home Front Defense, the terrorist wave broke out, and we suddenly understood that the state of Israel, and particularly the Israeli police, must prepare themselves differently in order to deal with this new threat. For that, we have taken a few steps. In my opinion, they're groundbreaking steps, and as a result, we were able to reduce the threat of terrorism. Of course, not fully, but quite significantly. The threat is still there. We cannot hide it. And while part of the Muslims in Israel and in the world, it's not the majority, of course not the majority, but even if we're talking about a part and the huge, vast Muslim population in the world, we're still talking about a large number of people. And while these people interpret the Islam, the religion of Islam, as calling them to kill the people they perceive as infidels, sometimes, by the way, it's their siblings, their brothers, the other Muslims who are more moderate. When this is still happening, we have the source of terrorism in Israel and in the world. What I'm trying to say is that after we understood this threat, and we understand that it is happening not just in Israel, but in the Western, and not just the Western world suffers from this terrorism, my main message here today is that once democratic countries, not just the state of Israel, all democratic countries undergo the process that we have gone through in the last 2 years, they have a historic opportunity to create a new coalition. President Trump has mentioned this, to create a new coalition, new international coalition against terrorism, where we will have as members not just Israel, United States, other Western countries, countries of the European Union, but also the Sunni Arab countries, for whom this threat, the threat of their regimes, is not less, but even maybe more important and immediate than what we see in the West, because on the perception level, these countries, together with the countries in the West, are starting to understand that terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. It doesn't matter if it happens in London or in Jerusalem. And on the operational level as well, there is this peak, zenith of the desire of Western countries to learn from the experience of the security and intelligence forces of Israel. And this gives rise to this opportunity to build a new coalition against terrorism, which will maybe lead to the cooperations that the Minister of Defense and Prime Minister are talking about. Thanks to this cooperation on the operational and intelligence level, we will be able to lever this cooperation to other political opportunities for normalization, to a certain extent, with some of the Arab world. I have been acting for several years with my colleagues throughout the world to promote the establishment of this coalition, because in addition to just saying this, we have to put some content into it. What does it mean, international coalition to fighting terrorism? As we understand, and as other countries in the world understand, while every country fights separately, their success in fighting terrorism will also be only partial. Only if we collaborate in this battle will we be able to deal a really death blow, not just to the local terrorist organizations, but to the sources of terrorism, to incitement, online incitement, which is one of the greatest generators of terrorist attacks that we see throughout the world, the sources of financing of these activities, and of course the different movements and transactions of terrorist operatives from country to country. So I'm very delighted to tell you that only 2 weeks ago I met the new Minister for Homeland Security, John Kelly, Minister John, who was a very important general. And we have agreed in principle to promote the establishment of this coalition on fighting terrorism. And if I am just to give you an example, a small example of what this means, it means that if we understand that there is a new threat greatly to the advancement in terrorism, and this is the threat of drones, every person may now go into a store or go online on Amazon and order one, and you can see what ISIS is doing with those drones and other terrorist organizations are doing with those drones. Again, drones that each and every one of us can just purchase if they want to. So as part of that emerging coalition, I have agreed with General Kelly that Israel will be a part of a working group for developing a response to this new threat of drones. But again, this is of course just one example of the advantages that this coalition could offer. It's very important for me to mention that when I speak about this new threat of lone wolf terrorisms, it's important to understand what are the characteristics of this phenomenon. One of the main characteristics is that if in the past terrorists were directed by terrorist organizations with a hierarchical structure, and our intelligence organization knew those terrorist organizations, they could track the main operatives there and so on. Now these terrorists, they receive their inspiration from extreme organizations, but they don't operate in a hierarchical system. They are not given orders to go out and perform some terrorist attack. Usually they do so on their own accord or in small local groups. Sometimes it's even a spontaneous decision, very short-term decision, which is done in light of a personal crisis, sometimes even some sort of a family crisis, or the memorial of a family member who has died in conflict with the security agencies or something like that. And so when we are talking about incitement, there too has been a significant change, because if in the past incitement happened as part of the work of organizations and leaders, we would hear it in mosques or in schools, in universities. Now it is happening, online. It reaches much broader circles of potential terrorists through social networks, through mobile phones that each and every one of us hold. So this terror wave that I was talking about in Israel, it burst out in 2000 2015, and until now we have experienced about 400 terrorist attacks, including stabbing and vehicle issues and running into the crowd. So, if I were to mention some of the steps that would be able to bring about a change, especially with the actions of the IDF in Judea and Samaria. First of all, since we understood that it would be very difficult to anticipate where the future terrorist attack would happen, and this is, of course, the challenge faced by the intelligence agencies everywhere. We have no other choice but to deploy many police officers throughout the country. So, in fact, we're going back slightly to the classic patrolling. We have now units of beat cops like we used to have in the past, because this enables quick response to every type of event, and the speed of response is in fact the main factor to our response to a small terrorist event. We also turn sensitive arenas to more controlled arenas, and this could be done, of course, by building blocks in bus stations or installing security cameras in certain locations. In 2018, we will finish a very important project called Look on Jerusalem, which will include a network of smart security cameras throughout Jerusalem. Some of them are LPR cameras that read license car numbers of vehicles. Others are cameras that identify suspected activities of people. And I can tell you in this respect, and this has to do with the terror attack that resulted in the death of Hadas Malka, is that the gate where she was killed, a gate that has become a symbol for the Palestinians, and has seen 32 terrorist attacks in the past year. It is about to change completely in the coming year. I don't want to say that we're going to flatten it out, but we're going to create dramatic changes there that will enable the police officers to have better visibility, to have better sight on what is happening there. And of course, we need to make the necessary adjustments on the infrastructure level so we can respond to those terrorists. We have also expanded the ability to weapons licenses to civilians with the proper background and training, and the civilians help us also to shorten our response times. We are destroying terrorist homes much quicker in order to create deterrence. We're working against people who are staying in Israel illegally and their employers. We are confiscating weapons, illegal weapons, every single night. And what is most important for me, because this is really drying out those swamps, we have acted to outlaw incisive organizations. Of course, I'm talking about the northern branch of the Islamic movement, the Momarabitun, the incitement that they cause on Temple Mount, which is very influential on individual terrorists, and outlawing these organizations. I talk about it a lot with my counterparts throughout the world, because they think about it in other places in the world. This is what enabled us to reach the sources of financing for these organizations. And to our surprise, we discovered that countries like Turkey or other countries are really sending money into Israel, into other Western countries, money which is contributing to this incitement that in turn is directing those terrorists. Now, as I've said, it's very important to understand that the fight against terrorism, against terrorists themselves, is not enough, and it's insufficient. We have to fight terrorism and incitement, whether if it is coming from organizations that are perceived as extreme organizations, and also if this incitement is coming from organizations such as the Palestinian Authority, which is not perceived as an extreme organization, unfortunately, but the glorification that they provide for terrorists or for their actions is in fact perceived as support to the next terrorist event. And of course we must remember the financing mechanism which the Palestinian Authority has created. In recent years, in recent days, we have seen the visit of Jared Kushner here with his envoy Jason Greenblatt, and I must commend them for working together, of course, under the auspices of President Trump, that they are speaking with the Palestinians about the importance of stopping the incitement and the glorification of terrorists. And they have even visited and consoled Hadass Malka's family, and I think this is very worthy of praise. But at the same time, the same Abu Mazen which they've met just yesterday is the same person who is going to pay from now on to the terrorists who have killed Hadass Malka. He's going to pay salaries to their families for many years to come, and these phenomena cannot reside together. They not. I understood the hint. 3-4 minutes more. It is impossible, it is inconceivable that when we and President Trump want to promote a political process, and we want to be part of this important process, at the same time this Palestinian Authority, which is perceived as our potential partner, will continue through the American taxpayers' money, and the European taxpayers' money will continue to finance this incitement that causes those terrorists to come and kill police women and policemen and many civilians in the state of Israel. So as I've said, there are many more countries who want to learn from us, to hear about the systems and the techniques that we use to fight terrorism. And thanks to that, we have an opportunity, really an opportunity, to create that international coalition that will help us together to dry out the sources of world terrorism. It is completely different, of course, when I demand Facebook or internet companies to promote regulation, proactive regulation for the removal of incitement from social media, or when, as it happened in recent weeks, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May, or the Prime Minister of France, they formulate this document with their mans together with the G7, and this makes the internet companies much more proactive in their actions. So as I've said, and I will conclude with that, we have a lot of threats on our borders. This has been mentioned before, that could be the threat of Hezbollah and the threat of Iran, which is trying to create a land corridor. And these threats could, as we've seen in the past, lead to miscalculation on one side of the other, could lead to a deterioration and even to a broader conflict in the shape of a military campaign or even a war. But what we're seeing in our daily life in Israel and in the world is that lone wolf terrorism, which is not really lone wolf, because it's very difficult to talk about this phenomenon as lone wolf when we understand that they are working under the auspices or in the under the influence of an ideological platform of extreme organizations. And this is what the citizens in the West, and not just in the West, experience in their daily life. Those terrorist attacks that no one can anticipate when they will happen. And we can build here an international coalition with the Sunni states that really want to learn from our experience and to receive intelligence from us that will enable them to deal much better with these threats. And maybe thanks to our knowledge and intelligence that we will share with them, maybe we will be able, God willing, to reach a process of normalization, and this would be the platform for political negotiations which could possibly bear fruits with our neighbors. Thank you very much.